Hello friends, I'm Aisling and you're very welcome here. As per usual, I'm here today to talk about books and more specifically the books that I read in February. So February was a bit of a mixed bag, we shall say. I read a couple of chunks and then I read some books that I felt okay about, just okay. This month I actually wrote some notes because my memory just does not work and I feel like I'm reading these books but they're just not going in or something. After like a week I'm like, I don't know what that was about. I'm going to see Dune Part 2 on Saturday and I have read the book, I have seen Dune Part 1, and when I watched a recap of Dune Part 1 I was like, I don't know what's going on. So that's where my brain is at. Let's get cracking. So the first book that I finished in February was a chunker. It was, I think, about 1100 pages and I loved them. So the book in question is Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson, and it is the second book in the Stormlight archive. So I read A Way of Kings last year, kind of on a whim, wasn't really planning on it, my first ever Brandon Sanderson book, and oh my word, I was in. I was in. I really enjoyed that. So we're kind of returning to a planet that is swept by threatening storms, a world finding itself caught up in war and political games, and these games are kind of set to affect the lives of thousands of people. It's really hard to describe this book or these books as a whole because so much goes on in them. This series is so far made up of 4 books, but by December this year we should be getting a 5th book. And I want to get to a point where I'm ready to go at book 5 when it's published in December. Sounds relatively easy, right? But these books are very, very long. Also, there are a couple of like smaller novellas that go with this and I don't want to skip them. I'd like to read those as well. So after this, there's a novella. It's just, I think, like maybe between 100 and 200 pages, but I want to read that. And then we have the next big book and then there's another novella and so on. So it's a bit of an undertaking, but I'm doing it, right? These books, they are incredibly intimidating when you see them in person. They're super chunky. I had no real intention of reading them, but then I picked up the first one on a whim off of Sean, my partner's shelves, and that was it. So I found quite quickly that Brandon Sanderson's writing just absolutely drew me in and I didn't care how many pages. In fact, I would have been happy with more, that kind of way. So we primarily follow, I think, like 3 characters. So we have Dalinar, Kaladin and Shallan. So Dalinar is I think he's like in his 50s and he is sort of very heavily involved in politics, but he's also somebody who's been out on the field in like loads of battles. He's really like battle worn and he's a good guy and he's really interesting. And then we have Kaladin, and Kaladin is also somebody who is involved and tied up in war, but he comes from a very different, very not privileged background, shall we say, and we find out some really interesting things about Kaladin and magic. And then we have Shallan, and this book is kind of focused a lot on her background, which I was so excited and happy about because I think she's my favourite POV. There are other POVs in the book, but the main ones are these 3 essentially, and we find out a lot more about Shallan's background, and she's more of like an academic. She is incredible at like sketching, at drawing, and she's quite naive, but I really like her character arc and where she seems to be going. And I've talked about this book at length in a vlog that I did recently enough, so I'm not going to bang on about it, but this is one of the Cosmere books, which is Brandon Sanderson's kind of overarching universe where he sets a lot of his books, not all of his books, but probably most, I would say. This is only my second Brandon Sanderson book, so I don't know what the story is in terms of how these books intertwine with each other, things like that, but apparently it gets really interesting the more that you read. You see how things kind of click together and you see like these little Easter eggs and stuff, and I'm really looking forward to getting to that point. I have a long ways to go, but yeah, the world building, the setting, the characters, the magic system, the intrigue, the pacing, the writing, chef's kiss, like very good. This is a book that I obviously really adored. But as somebody who's kind of only recently properly kind of gotten into fantasy, I would say, like, if you're a lit fic girly, or you know, you're not really into fantasy, this is not one for you. This is fantasy. Absolutely. Also incredible, but you know, not for everybody. And then next up, we have a book that is part of a series that I have been reading for what feels like ages now. So I started reading the Mortal Instruments series by Cassandra Clare last year, and I am on book 5 now, which is City of Lost Souls. So I know that these books were incredibly popular when they were being published, but we're talking, you know, I think this one was 2012 and this is the 5th book. So in some ways they are quite dated, but they hold a really special place in a lot of people's hearts. These are young adult fantasy novels. So again, if you're not into fantasy and you're not into young adult, don't do it to yourself. But we follow Clary Frey, and she is a teenager who is living in New York, has grown up in New York her whole life. So it's an urban fantasy. And she doesn't know, because her mother has kept it from her, that she is a shadow hunter. So in the first book we find out that Clary is a shadow hunter, and these are kind of a secret society of people who basically fight evil. So like demons and evil things, other evil things. I can't think of any other evil things, but like these books have werewolves, they have, I was about to say Draculas, they have vampires, they have a lot of other kind of mythical creatures, demons, they have like strange kind of secret societies, and there's a lot going on here. And I have to hand it to Cassandra Clare, like the world building is pretty great, especially for YA novels. So this one in particular, then we're back with Clary, and one of the other main characters has sort of been turned to the evil side against his own best wishes, and she is trying to figure out how to bring him back to himself. He is kind of under control, I guess, of our main antagonist in this book. I won't say much more because obviously it's a sequel of a sequel of a sequel of a sequel. Definitely much more of the same. It's definitely young adult. It's definitely a Shadowhunter book. If you like them, you like them, but I can understand why people wouldn't. I think they're a lot of fun though. The writing is good, the pacing is great. You can tell that Cassandra Clare really has an interest in sort of things like mythologies and ancient texts and things like that, and ancient societies and stuff. And it comes through in her writing. There's definitely quite a lot of research done, and yeah, there's romance as well for those of you who are into the romance. And I don't know, I don't have much to say about it. It's definitely much more of the same. I think I preferred the villain in the first 3 books to the villain in this trilogy, but yeah, it's good. Like, I'm looking forward to reading the final book, book number 6, and finding out how things go. That's City of Lost Souls. Next up then, we have a book that is part of a series that needs absolutely no introduction, and that is Heartstopper. So I read Heartstopper volume 4. So I have officially read all of the Heartstopper books that are on my shelves. I'm aware that there's a 5th one, and I think there's a 6th one coming. Don't hold me to that. These are a series of graphic novels. I would imagine most people are aware of them at least by now, and they are written and illustrated by Alice Oseman. And in this one, again, we follow Nick and Charlie and all of the other side characters as they kind of navigate teenhood and queerness and a lot of problems otherwise that, you know, people generally deal with growing up. So issues with family, issues with identity, that sort of thing. Alice Oseman has a way of writing such sweet stories, but they also don't shy away from the realities of life. And I love how she uses panels that don't have dialogue to further the story. I think it's one of her real strengths as a comic artist, and I think she's fantastic. So in this one in particular, Charlie is dealing with some mental health issues, and Nick is sort of dealing with issues with his family, issues with his absent father, and how to kind of navigate telling him that he's bisexual, or even if he deserves that. Yeah, so I feel like these books are just so great. They've been basically like a cultural phenomenon, and what they, I'm sure, are doing for young people nowadays is incredible. Like, representation matters. I always say it. I will say, in terms of Charlie's mental health stuff, maybe if you have particular triggers, just look that up just in case. But otherwise, I just found it to be lovely, just like the other ones. But I will say that's the last one that I owned, and I don't know if I'm that fussed about going out to buy the fifth one. I've already unhauled 4 of them. I found it really lovely again, and I just feel like these books are a warm hug for people who are really struggling with just being humans, I guess. And next up we have another chunk of a book coming in at over 800 pages, and that is Assassin's Quest by Robin Hobb. So this is the 3rd book in the Farseer trilogy, which is part of course, the larger overarching series called The Realm of the Elderlings. This series I have talked about at length, but basically we follow Fitz, who is a very young boy, is dropped at the door of the keep of a castle. It turns out he is the illegitimate son of the king in waiting. So he's taken into the keep, but he's not really accepted as part of the family. And so he is basically raised by the stable masters. So he grows up around a lot of horses, a lot of dogs, like a lot of animals, spends a lot of time in the stables. And one of the things that I really love about this series is his connection with animals. It's like, oh, it just warms my heart. I just love that about these books, that animals become such a huge part of the story. And so Fitz then, as he gets a bit older, is taken on by a tutor at the king's request, and the king has decided to train him as an assassin. We learn about a type of magic that Fitz has innately that's actually really frowned upon, but I loved it. And it's great. It's a really subtle form of magic, but it's fantastic. And so when he's trained as an assassin, he is trained in another type of magic that is part of sort of his family line. So people with the king's blood all have this sort of magic, but they need to be trained in it. They need to learn it. So there are 2 types of magic interplaying with each other in these books, and I find them to be absolutely brilliant, really subtle. These books overall, I have heard them criticized as being too slow. They're so character driven. I love the slowness. I love how Robin Hobb took her time. But then we come to Assassin's Quest. This book is essentially about a quest. Surprise, surprise. So Fitz is out for revenge, and he tries to go claim it, and he spends over 800 pages on a bit of a journey to find somebody. And it's definitely the slowest of the books, I will say. And I see the criticisms, like a lot of people were not happy with the pacing in this book, and a lot of people were not happy with the ending of this book. Personally, I loved it. It was a little bit frustrating to see Fitz go 2 steps forward, 1 step back for 800 pages. So yeah, there is that. It's definitely a harder read maybe than the others, just in terms of keeping up the momentum. Maybe there are some pacing issues, but to be honest with you, I always wanted to pick up this book. I didn't have any issues with the pacing, but I do see that, and I do see how people are frustrated with the ending. But personally, I really enjoyed it, and there is something that is spoken about for the 3 books. So we're talking, I don't know, like maybe 2,500 pages over these 3 books, or maybe 2,000 pages, something along those lines. It's a lot of pages, and they're talking about something, and you don't know what it is. You just assume you know what it is, and then in this book, just at the end, you find out what it is. And I tell you, I was not expecting it. I was like, oh my god, because it's one of my favourite things, but I'm not going to say any more, and you have to read the 3 books to find out. But I'm really surprised that that hadn't somehow been spoiled for me, because these books were written ages ago. I'm really glad that they weren't spoiled for me. I got really excited about that. Definitely do see the criticisms, but I don't care. I loved this trilogy with my whole heart. I said I wasn't going to go into the next trilogy soon, but I actually am, because I love Robin Hobb's writing, and that's all that matters. I don't care. I want to read what I want to read, right? It's a hobby, it's not a chore. The next trilogy then is the Live Ship Traders trilogy, and I'll probably start that very soon, like in the next week or 2. Really excited for it. I love Robin Hobb, and I always feel a little bit nervous about recommending her so enthusiastically, because it's the type of fantasy that's not going to be for everybody, but I feel like it's almost like a fantasy that's for people who like, now take this with a pinch of salt, but for people who like literary fiction a bit. And maybe that's a bit of a push, but it's definitely much slower, much more character driven, possibly not as fun as some other fantasies, but Ah, I love Robin Hobb. I love her. The next book that I read then, and I think for this one we should all be grateful that Goodreads exists, because I would have completely forgotten about it and I would have completely forgotten what happened in it. So this book was, sorry, this is a bit overexposed, but it's Asleep by Banana Yoshimoto. And my earlier exposure to Banana Yoshimoto was Kitchen, and I loved Kitchen. I read Kitchen quite some time ago. I really loved kind of the subtlety of the language, the sparseness of the story. I like that about a lot of Japanese writing, and this is translated by Michael Emmerich. So this one in particular is quite a short book, but it's a book of 3 short stories, and thematically they are all quite similar in that they all somehow relate to what seems like this kind of enchanted sleep. I literally had to look up what each of them was about again. I'm not going to get into detail on them, but I do feel like they're very classic Banana Yoshimoto writing. Some of the writing is really sharp and some of the observations are absolutely just on point. But for the most part, I didn't enjoy this very much. Now, maybe it was a case of right book, wrong time, but I just found it to be very slow. I didn't want to pick it up when I put it down, which isn't a great sign. It just kind of fell short of my expectations a little bit, maybe I will say. Maybe my expectations were too high. But I'd heard really good things about this, so maybe I'm just in a fantasy mood at the moment. I don't know, but it just didn't quite do it for me this time, which is okay. But I think I'm probably going to unhaul this now, because I'm sure there's somebody out there who'll appreciate it a lot more than I have. So yeah, that was Asleep. Next up then, I listened to a romance on audio. I know, who is she, right? This romance in particular is one that obviously always comes really highly recommended, and that was Beach Read by Emily Henry. So it was my first Emily Henry book. I didn't know what to expect. I'm not much of a romance reader, so I was a little bit about the whole thing going into it, but I had been told that Emily Henry's romance is romance but much more nuanced, just basically more like something that I would enjoy in particular. So I said, look, I'll give it a go. So we follow January, who moves to a small seaside town, and she is an author and she's trying to write her next book. So she's a romance author, and it turns out she moves in beside Gus, who is also an author, but he's much more literary fiction. And they become friends, and they place a bet because they're both kind of struggling with what they're writing, and they place a bet to see if the other one can write what the other one writes. So basically January has to write something kind of like the next great American novel, and Gus has to write a romance novel. From there, you know, things progress. It is a romance. I found this to be quite enjoyable. I really liked some of the commentary in it. So there's some great commentary about like women's writing, women authors, women's fiction. Maybe a little bit on the nose, but I found it to be really good. I just found myself really engaged. I was really surprised with it. It's definitely maybe much more nuanced than other romance that I have read. Now, there was a part in it, and as I said, I was listening to this on an audiobook, and there was an ableist slur when the author referred to some people dancing. I was a bit surprised, to be honest. I was a bit taken aback. I was walking and listening, and nothing was going in, because I was like, I can't believe that word was just said. But I know that also that word is much more loosely used in slang in the States than it is over here. Doesn't mean I have to like it. I really disliked it. It lost me for a while, and I almost stopped reading. I won't lie, I almost stopped listening to it, but I kept going, and overall I'm glad that I did, but I still am disappointed. I did find the ending a little bit too sweet, a little bit too wholesome for me. It ties up too nicely maybe. But yeah, it was enjoyable overall. I didn't adore it, but I did enjoy it, and I will happily pick up some more Emily Henry in the future. Okay, next then, The Soulmate by Sally Hepworth. So this is a contemporary thriller. We follow a couple who has made a fresh start. So they have moved to a small seaside town, and they live on a lovely house by the sea with their 2 young daughters. Now, down the end of their garden, behind the fence, is a cliff, and it's really infamous. It's known as the Drop because it's a really well-known suicide spot, and the husband in the couple, his name is Gabe, he gets a bit of a name for himself as somebody who's really good at talking people down from jumping off of this cliff. But this book is about the one time that somebody jumps. Sounds relatively straightforward, but from the get-go we wonder, did Gabe actually push this person? It's quite twisty, it's quite fast-paced, but friends, it's another one I didn't really quite enjoy. I found the writing to be a little bit juvenile. I don't know, I just felt like I wanted more depth in the characters. I wanted to feel more for them. I didn't really care. I was like, I hate everybody. And I know that not every novel has to have likable characters, but I feel like this novel might have felt a bit more high stakes had it actually had some likable characters. There was a perspective in here as well, so it's written from kind of the point of view of a few different people. And there was a particular perspective that I found a bit strange, and I saw the necessity of it and how it was a really good kind of, I suppose, device for telling parts of the story and seeing things that maybe we might not have already been able to see from the perspectives of other characters. It pulled me out of the story a little bit, and there's a trope in here that I know a lot of people just really, really hate in domestic thrillers, and I wouldn't say I hate it, but I'm not a big fan of it either. And I don't know, like, I read the whole thing and I read it quite quickly. It was really fast paced and it was twisty, but it just wasn't one of my favourite thrillers, unfortunately. Each to their own. I was considering using this as my Australian book for my Around the World reading challenge, but to be honest with you, I got about a third of the way into the book before I actually realised that it was set in Australia. So I don't know, it feels maybe like a bit of a cheat if I use it for Australia, so I think I'll hold off on it. It's just very contemporary and it feels like it could be set anywhere. Like, it's not a criticism of the author in that regard. I feel like it's definitely a book that could pull somebody out of a reading slump, and I feel like it's definitely a book that a lot of people will enjoy, but for me personally, it's just not what I'm into. And then last but not least, I listened to and read Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So this is another novel that needs absolutely no introduction. I mean, it's got a whole TV show. I haven't watched the TV show, so I went into this pretty blind. I had heard that the audiobook was incredible for this. Now, I did have it on my Kindle as well, and I remember opening it on my Kindle and realising, oh, this is kind of an interview form, so you have a person's name and then they're talking, telling about the story. So we are following the story of a band from the 70s, kind of how they got together and then their life in the band, and then how they broke up, and even further on into their lives after that. And nobody really knows why this band broke up, so this is kind of that story. I will say I definitely understand why some people thought that this was an actual real book, because it's really well done. So yeah, it's a Taylor Jenkins Reid book. It's really immersive, it's really compulsive. The characters are great. I thought they were fleshed out really well. I knew who was talking, I knew who they were, I knew what they were about, I knew what band member they were, and I knew what instrument they played or what part they played in the band, which I thought was really great. So I won't lie, given how much people love this story, I kind of thought something really explosive was going to happen maybe in the third act, but that wasn't really the case. I had read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo maybe the year before last, and there is in that like this big event that just kind of blows you away, and I just thought that there would be something like that in this, and it, you know, that didn't really happen. Like, things do happen and the story moves, the pacing is great, but I don't know, maybe my expectations were too high, or maybe I left it too long to read this book, but I did enjoy it. I just didn't love it. I definitely preferred The Seven Husbands, but that said, I really enjoyed this. I'm happy to read more Taylor Jenkins Reid. One thing I will say as well is that I did read like the last little bit of this book on Kindle rather than audio, and I actually think in this instance, I'm not normally an audiobook person, but I think in this instance the audiobook was actually a better reading experience, surprisingly. It was really well produced, like really, really good. If you're going to read this book, if you're one of the last people on the planet that hasn't yet read this book, I'd actually recommend it on audio if it's available to you. So that is the entirety of my read for February. I hope that everybody watching has had a really great reading month. I always love to hear about what people are reading. If you want to like pop a comment below, let me know what you've read in February and if you've enjoyed it. Any book anybody mentions, I genuinely do look it up and I do take notes. So yeah, I have some quite long lists on the go. But yeah, of course, I just want to thank you so much from the bottom of my silly little heart for watching. I really appreciate you being here. And just a reminder that if you're not subscribed already, that subscribe button does exist. No pressure. Otherwise, I hope you're well. I hope you're minding yourself. I hope you're reading some really good books. And that's that. Take care and I'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.